Welcome all to ITAR group, and thank you, Professor Lisa, for accepting my invitation. This webinar will be recorded. Our speaker today is Professor Lisa Jack. Lisa Jack is a professor of accounting and finance in University of Portsmouth in UK, and the former president of the British Accounting and Finance Association. Her books include Accounting and Social Theory in Introduction 2017, and the Routledge Companion to Accounting Communication in 2013 with Jane Davison and Russell Kerridge. She is the author of several papers in academic journals, including Accounting, Organization, and Society, and of research consultancy reports for CIMA and others. She is part of Master of Science for Forensic Accounting teaching team at Portsmouth and leads the unit on financial crime and the law. Her particular research interest is in accounting and management control in the food and drink industry and its impact on society and environment. After the presentation will take 45 to 1 hour, and then after that we'll open the floor for 1 hour for question. Thank you all again, and thank you, Professor Lisa, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ahmed, and thank you again for inviting me. It's a great honor, and particularly to see such a good size of audience here today. It shows there's a real need for your seminars.
Thank you.
So I'm just about to share my screen, and then I'll explain what I'm going to talk about today. Okay, so I think that's being shared now. And can you confirm that you can see the screen? Okay.
Just a minute. Until now, it's, yeah, now, give us a second. Yes, now we can see it, yes.
It always takes a moment. So
yeah.
Thank you very much indeed. So in discussion with Dr. Ahmed, we decided that I would talk about some of the lessons I've learned about publishing in academia. But I think some of the things I'm going to say will also be applicable if you're writing professional reports or if you're engaged in some sort of teaching. So it's a few lessons I've learned about writing in particular. And I thought I would give you this picture of my latest book. Now, you can get this book in English, but it was a very proud moment for me when I got a message saying that they were going to translate it into Korean. So it's the first time anybody's ever translated one of my books into another language, as far as I know. So I'm very proud of this book, even though I do not read Korean myself. So I wanted to tell you a little bit, first of all, about my own journey and how I came to be writing and publishing in academia. So my original degree had nothing to do with accounting, or very little to do with accounting, you might think. I studied classical Greek and mathematics at Keele University in the UK. Now, you'll see the picture on the screen, and this is my favorite story from ancient Greek history. They discovered some 3,000-year-old clay tablets on which there were these ideograms or pictures, and they realized after a long time of research that it was actually writing. It was a very early form of the Greek language. And people got very excited. They thought they'd found early poetry or early literature. In fact, what they had found when they finally managed to translate it was a stock inventory. It basically said 12 wagon wheels, 13 bottles of oil, or words to that effect, which shows us that accounting was part of the very earliest forms of writing and, if you like, publishing. After my degree in Greek and mathematics, I went on to become a qualified accountant. I worked as an auditor for nearly 10 years. Eventually became a fellow of the Association of Chartered Certified Accountants, which I believe many of you will be aware of. But after that time, for various reasons, I decided I'd actually be much rather teaching than going on to a management position where I didn't actually do the audits myself. And I got a basic teaching position in a local college. And during that time, I took my certificate in education. So I became a qualified teacher as well as a qualified accountant. That led me to teaching in a land-based college, so an agricultural college. And it was there that I was encouraged to start another qualification, a master's. But I realized that my professional qualification already worked. I wouldn't have to do any more taught sessions. I'd only have to write a dissertation. So I thought if I was going to write a dissertation, I might as well do an MPhil. And I took that with the University of Essex, and that turned into a PhD. I never completed the MPhil. They just converted it into a PhD. I eventually got a job there as well. And by 2004, I had a research and teaching post at the University of Essex. I completed the PhD, and my first paper was published in 2005 in Management Accounting Research, based on my thesis, which was on agricultural accounting and its peculiarities in England. It was a social history, interpretative, qualitative thesis. I hadn't expected that at all, because my degree in maths, I thought, well, I'll be able to do the statistics, no problem. But it turned out the subject was not amenable to statistics in any way at all. So I sort of became a sociologist in that time, and a sociologist has an added problem. You need to be able to write very well. You can't be too formulaic. Anyway, I published other papers, and my first book on benchmarking in food and farming was published in 2009. And about that time, I became professor at Portsmouth. And people usually say, well, that was quick. But you have to remember, I had quite a long career in teaching and accounting before I became a lecturer and researcher at Essex. So I came down to Portsmouth in 2009. And this is important. I'd published all those works, but my very first, if you like, top paper was only published in 2018. We first submitted it in 2015, so I'll tell you the rest of that story later. So what I want to do is I want to go through some of the lessons I've learned, because publishing in academic life is not so easy. And I'm sure many of you are either looking towards that or have understood that. In fact, writing isn't easy at all, whether it's an essay or an article for a newspaper, or it's a professional report, or it's an academic paper or a thesis. So I'm hoping that most of you will be able to get something from my experiences. And the first thing I've learned is that times really do change.
Prof,
Things have, yes?
sorry for interrupt. You didn't move the slides, yeah? It's because it's still in the title page, the cover page.
Oh dear, I did have another page open, so I have moved the slides, yes. Ah, so you're not seeing them. Let me try something else. It will remove the animation. How about that? Can you see the page now?
Yes, yes.
Okay, I'll do the unanimated version then. Is that better?
As you like, but now we can see it, yes.
Yes. Okay. So this is what I was talking about. This was my academic journey, and this is the picture of the ancient Greek writing that's really a stock inventory. Okay, so can we just check? If I do this, can you now see the next page?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, that's brilliant. Okay, and what I'll also do is I'll lose, you don't want to see that. I'll hide the ribbon so we can see even more of the presentation.
Okay.
So what I've learned is that times change, things change. And most of what I've seen, and this is quite important, what's required for employment in academia and even in other walks of life has changed in the last 15 years. So when I got my job at Essex, they were thrilled that I had a paper under review. Yeah, they said it's quite unusual. They were even more thrilled when it was published, but they were thrilled that I'd even got a paper under review, and by the time I had my viva, I had to revise and resubmit. But then that was quite unusual. They'd employed me anyway. Now, it's very difficult to get that first post unless you actually have a published paper, and ideally in a very good journal. And that puts quite a lot of pressure on people to be able to write at a high level very quickly. And also, although I'd finished my PhD quite soon after I got the job, nowadays people are looking for more evidence of completion. And there's more pressure, I think, on people to be able to write and publish very early on. And we have to remember that because also the demographics, particularly in accounting, have changed in Europe. If you think about it as an academic subject, it's only really been around since the 1980s. It's been in universities for most of the 20th century, but it was a vocational or technical subject. And I think it still is the case in a lot of countries that it's seen primarily as a technical subject. But it became a research-based subject sometime around in the 1970s, 1980s. And therefore, there were quite a lot of very senior people. But what's happened very much in the last 10 years, and I noticed this change even when I was president of British Accounting and Finance Association, that the demography has changed and we have far more early career researchers and not enough senior researchers to support them necessarily. And therefore the pressures have changed as well. And there's a lot more competition to publish. And also fashions change. So, and I think this is quite important because quite often we model our writing on the work that we read while we were doing a PhD and the work that was written 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago. But the style of writing now has changed very much. It's far more direct. There's not so much room to be literary. And there's been a far bigger move in business schools towards standardization. So in other words, there's a standard format, a standard style almost for writing papers, which people are expected to know. And therefore, if you're modeling your writing style on the papers that you may be reading from 15, 20 years ago, you also need to be reading papers from very recently to get a feel. And this applies to me as well, because how I wrote and and the papers I read and the papers I modeled myself on 15 years ago, I've had to change the way I write as well. And one of the things the main thing I'm going to be talking about in this presentation is about how you get the beginning of your work really clear, because the biggest thing that's changed is writing introductions and conclusions to those papers. they've become even more important, because with that growing population, with that competition, and with that requirement to get published, has come a need to be absolutely crystal clear right from the start of the paper what you are talking about. And also is a way of getting people involved. So I'm going to talk a bit about that, because it's also about how you write well. So writing well has become about writing very good introductions. And that's true of virtually every type of writing. So going along with this is an idea of, well, how do you become original? Because your work has got to be original to hit those high quality journals, or even the ones where the scope is more limited, because I don't like to say they're poor quality journals. They're not. They just publish a different type of writing. So the question comes is, how do I make my mark? And very much when you're a beginner writer, you want to do something that's different. But really, you can't get away from, in academic writing or in other forms of professional writing, it's more about the content, the contribution, and the clarity of what you're saying. And I've had two very good pieces of advice in my career. One was from my supervisor, Will Seal, Professor Will Seal. He said, yes, you might want to be original with the way you write your paper. Maybe you don't want to do a literature review. Maybe you don't think it's relevant in your case. But actually, that's what your people are looking for. His advice was to just take the standard structure and be original in the content. But more than being original, make sure that you've got high quality content. The other piece of advice was from Professor Mike Power at the London School of Economics on a course I was on once. And I've always kept this in mind, because when I'm reviewing papers, particularly from early career researchers, they try and pack everything into the paper. They try and say a lot of things and address a lot of questions. But in fact, the best papers take one idea and develop it in depth. And he said he had this just brief slogan, if you like: one paper, one idea. If you've got lots of ideas, then you've got lots of papers, if you've got sufficient data. And my advice is, from my career, don't just write papers, write different things as well. I've written quite a lot of consultancy type reports because of the research I've done. I've written papers, articles for newspapers and for professional magazines. And occasionally nowadays I write blogs as well. But they're very good, because the more you write, the more you think, and the more you polish your style and become concise and clear. So I've learned this because when I started, my writing was quite flowery, as we call it. So very embellished, quite literary. But in fact, that doesn't work. And if you really want to communicate your ideas in academic writing, it's more about not aiming to be too picturesque. So there's a very famous writer you may well have come across in Britain called George Orwell, who wrote Animal Farm in 1984 and a number of other novels and essays. And he wrote a very famous essay called Why I Write. And he said that over time he'd become less picturesque and aimed more for clarity. He said that good prose is like a window that you can see through. And he's very inspirational. Mind you, he admits to his faults in the essay. But like me, I found that I'd gone through this learning process of how to write clearly for an audience. So the point is, as academics or as professional accountants, we are also professional writers. And one of the things I've learnt quite a lot is to talk to professional writers in any field. So the reason you have this gentleman at the top on the right is he's a colleague of mine from Essex called Dr. Adrian May, who taught creative writing. He's a poet, songwriter, and academic, and he's just retired, but he does also publish books. And he is a professional writer. He has been for all his adult life and probably longer. And he teaches people in creative writing who think that the novel or the poem just pours out and that you have inspiration and it goes onto the page. What he teaches them is what all professional writers know, which is that writing and editing are two different things. A lot of people get hung up because they take so long to write because they're trying to get the English correct. And this goes for whether you speak English as a first language, second language, third or fourth language. They're trying so hard to get the expression and the grammar and everything correct that they don't get on very fast with their writing. But professional writers write and rewrite and revise and edit. And you have to go through those processes. The worst thing you can do is try and do them both at the same time. And what I'm really grateful for was that I met Dr. May very early on in about 2007, and I was getting into a real hole trying to write well. And he taught me this, and I've read it several times since, and I've spoken to lots of professional writers since in a number of different fields, and they say exactly the same thing. So the key lesson, if you learn nothing else this afternoon, never try and write and edit at the same time. Turn off your internal editor. I also learned it from this great book called How to Write a Lot. It is an academic book, and it's written by a psychologist who knows all the reasons why we don't write. And he also taught me that writing is composed of tasks. And if you really can't get the words on the page, then you can always check your references or do some editing or seek out some data. Because the biggest problem people have is that they get hung up about the fact they're not writing. And they find all sorts of displacement activities. And famously, I think a lot of writers, including myself, when they have something important to write, suddenly have very clean houses and have all their books in alphabetical order because they found other things to do before they start writing. Now, a little procrastination is no bad thing. It gets the brain working. But at some point, you just have to put your fingers on the keyboard or your pen in your hand and start writing. And this is what you learn from professional writers who write every day. And one of the things I like about How to Write a Lot by Paul de Silva is that he points out that Anthony Trollope, who was another British author who wrote really quite long books, also had a day job. He worked for the post office all of his life. He worked from 10 to 4 every day. In those days, you worked 10 to 4, not 9 to 5. But every day he wrote 500 words on his literary novels. And it is that professional writers set themselves tasks and targets. And if they really get stuck, they do one of the other tasks or targets that they've got. And I found this really helpful, even if I can only do 15 minutes a day because of other commitments. I always try and do that, at least, on a writing task. It keeps it going. And famously, again, it is quite possible to write a paper in 12 weeks on only 15 minutes a day. And that's maybe something we can talk about later. You don't need a week or a space of time. You just need to write. And that's what I learned. And it was great psychologically. It was very freeing. It meant that I could see what I was doing. So academic writing is rarely a work of art, but it's a craft that needs to be learned. And just in case you were in any doubt, so is poetry. It doesn't just come from the brain. So I wanted to say a bit more, and this lesson is very quick. changing from being a professional writer, what's it like being a prof who writes? Now, I'll tell you about this lady in a minute, but as I've said, what I've really learned, if there's one thing I've learned in 15 years of being a professor who writes, it's that introductions and conclusions are crucial, and you need to get them right. I've also learned a lot with my co-authors who've come from a number of different countries and traditions, and of the people I've mentored, that different cultures have different writing traditions. Yes, I'm privileged to come from an English-speaking background, but in fact, if I'm trying to publish in an American English-speaking journal, even I have problems. So I've come to learn quite a lot about the different ways that people write and how to appreciate that. But when you're writing together with a co-author, you learn to appreciate each other's writings, but in the end, quite often we're trying to publish in Anglo-American journals. And so we get caught in this culture of writing. And as I said, it's become a very standardized culture. The other thing I've learned is you can't turn poor data into a gold star paper. So however much I might want to help somebody, if the data is not poor, if the data is not up to it, then there is no way I can turn a paper automatically into a 3-star or a 4-star top paper. But I might be able to help you get it to be a very good, solid 2-star paper. And as I said, that's about scope and reach of the research. It's not about the quality of the journal. There are some excellent papers in 1- and 2-star journals. It's just that the data does not stand up to being used on a wide or broad scale. They're saying something interesting, but not of wide impact. Now, this lady is not a professor and she doesn't write. She's an illiterate farmer from South America, from Peru. But she's also an activist because she bought her own farm and then a mining company tried to take it away from her, claiming they had the rights to the land because there was gold underneath. And she and a few hundred other people protested because the company had pretty poor practices and had ruined the land around and about. They'd poisoned the water, allegedly, and destroyed the soil. So she became an activist. Now, that's not so important, except that it's a brilliant film called Maxima. The point is, it's a documentary. And in that documentary, there's a very good trailer. And in the trailer for that film, you learn everything you need to know about the film, even more or less the ending. Because it's not a thriller and it's not a mystery. That's not what we're writing. So whilst the film Parasite that won the Oscar this year, you really wouldn't want to give away that plot in a trailer. This is not what we're about. We're more about these documentaries or about those types of fiction films which get people in by giving you the whole story in a very short film. And our introductions should be like that. People are not going to read our paper for the nice surprise at the beginning, middle, or at the middle or the end. They want to know before they dive into the rest of the paper what it is we're arguing and what we're going to tell them. Just like a very good documentary or most film picture. It's not the sort of thing where you're giving people surprises or you're giving them the pleasure of getting to the end. And again, that's quite different because most of us grew up in a literary culture that likes to keep surprises and likes to make sure that you have something to read for to the end, but that's not what we're about. So 2 things here. This is a very good trailer at showing you how to fit the whole film into 2 minutes. It's also a very good film if you ever get the chance to watch it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk to you about my 4-star paper, the one in Accounting, Organizations and Society, about the food industry, because it took me 15 years to really understand fully how to write a good beginning to a paper. And what I want to do is I want to share this with you. And it also gives you me an opportunity to talk about my own research while I'm doing that. I've recently applied the same techniques to the paper I'm writing at the moment. And if I've got time, I will tell you a little bit about that piece of research as well. And this is the thing I've learned most. And it's also the biggest mistake I see when I'm reviewing other people's work, and particularly the work of new writers. I made the same mistake, so we know what's going on. The mistake is that you start with some generalizations and generalizations about the world. So one example from a forensic accounting paper recently was somebody who started off by essentially saying, financial crime is a terrible thing and it affects everybody the world over. Well, we know that. We don't need to know it in your paper. What you need to do is isolate what problem you're trying to get to. What is the real world problem that your paper is addressing? Why do we need to do this piece of research? Why should I read this paper? So whatever you're doing, even if it's a quantitative paper, and what I want to say is, I realize that a lot of people are doing quantitative work in accounting, but the same applies. So you need to, as I've said, state the real world problem that you're addressing. So in our particular piece of research, we were looking at the problems of accounting in and performance measurement in the food industry. Because allegedly, suppliers and others are not paid sufficient to maintain their businesses. And there are allegations that the way the accounting is used increases the level of unfairness in the industry. Also, there's been a change in the way the industry runs, and there are a lot of very large middlemen, if you like, in the industry. They're called super middlemen and women. So we set out straight away that the problem is this, that in developed countries, we expect almost a constant supply of fresh fruit and vegetables, which is coordinated through these very large companies. The problem is the consumers demand low prices, and therefore the net margins in these companies are actually very low. And the wages in the industry are very low. And we dug into this problem with our data, and we tried to find out where the unfairness lay. But the initial problem we set out is that we have this situation in which a small number of supermarkets dominate the industry. There are very low net margins and there are very low wages. Okay. Now, what I have to tell you is it took me 15 or 16 attempts to write this introduction, at least. And the one that was published was probably the 7th or 8th version of the paper. So I learned a lot because this wasn't my original introduction. But I learned that the best way was to go in straight with, what is the problem we're looking at? Now, your problem may not be quite as big as this one, but for a 4-star paper, they are looking for big real-world problems a lot of the time. So yours may be more related perhaps to earnings management or another issue, but it's really getting to what are the real-world consequences of what you're looking at. And the 3 other things you need to know is you need to be clear and precise. You need to support every assertion and fact. And if you look very carefully in the middle of that text, and I'm not expecting you to read it all now, but if you look very carefully, there is a rare footnote which actually gives the evidence that there really is 1 to 2% net margin turnover on average in the industry. And we've supported where we can that other people have used, have found similar things to us in terms of the way the food system is run. So we try to be very clear, very precise, and we don't make any assertions that we can't support. Now, I have to tell you, it took me ages to find the evidence to support that 1 to 2% margin. I knew it was correct, but actually digging down and finding a clear source for that was quite difficult because I couldn't just use my own calculations. The other thing is, there's no padding in this at all. The original paper actually had been written several times before I submitted it. And because it'd been written several times, it was quite tight. But the first thing I was told was I had to reduce it by 3,000 words. And then the final set of reviews said I had to take out yet another 1,000 words. So you have to take out everything that's non-essential. And this is actually a key thing for academic writing, learning what's non-essential and taking out phrases that you think are wonderful, but actually are not needed. And taking out all the things like what we call the descriptive words. You know, so you don't use it, this is a brilliant piece of evidence. You just say, this evidence. And it does actually make the writing a lot clearer, but it's really hard work. But that's an editing job. At the end, you need to take out the padding and get used to writing in a very clear way. And this is actually quite a problem in a number of languages that have a lot of courtesy in them, or where you don't necessarily culturally get directly to the point. Now, I'll leave you to decide whether that's your experience or not. But the way we write now in English is to take out that padding. And I have to say, for me, it's a change as well, because if you look at older papers in accounting, there's quite a lot of padding. Okay, so I learned that. And then if you'll notice, I've added another icon on here. The next thing you do is you say what you did and what we found. You don't leave it as a surprise, and you don't generalize. People quite often say we did a literature review which found important insights, but they don't tell you what literature they looked at, and they don't tell you what the insights are. They're just, we would say in English, teasing you to have a look, but that's not how academic writing works. So we were absolutely clear about what we'd done. Now, again, we were clear about what we did and about what we found, which was largely around the existence of gaming and unfair practices. So this is the other thing. So we have an actual pattern now emerging. And I think if you were to take a 4-star paper from a quantitative journal or from another qualitative journal or a 3-star paper and look at the good papers, you'll find they tend to follow this pattern. And I found it's quite a good one. So state the real world problem, be clear, be precise, support every assertion of fact, no padding, and then be very clear next about what you did and what you found. What after that? Well, The next thing you have to do is be very clear which literature you're talking about and where you're going to make your contribution. And you pull up the key papers. Now, for accounting food and the food industry, that's not very difficult. Originally, most of my papers had been in other disciplines, but they insisted I had to put in more accounting papers. Well, there are only 4 papers I could use. And therefore, I had to be quite precise that you know, there's not much literature in this area. So, but then again, it's not enough just to say, I'm contributing to these papers. You have to say what it is about these papers that you're contributing to. This goes back to the clarity and the precision. So for example, in the middle there, I'm saying the situation in fresh produce is very similar to the opportunistic and adversarial nature of the meat industry reported by Bowman and al. when they looked at pork, and by Free when he looked at coercive practices. Okay. So what I've given is a very high level but very condensed overview of the literature that I'm going to add to. And then at the bottom, in return to the literature, I'm saying we're going to extend the sparse literature in accounting, because I can make a claim for that because it really is. But I'm also going to extend the discussions in other interdisciplinary literature that talk about unfairness but don't talk about it from an accounting point of view. So this took some time, but eventually what emerged was this very tight paragraph about, this is the literature we're talking about, this is where our contribution lies. And if you can get that in even before you submit the first draft, you're likely to get your paper given far more attention than if the reviewer has to come back and ask you to do this. In my case, I thought we'd done it, but they asked for more. So again, new icon. Then set out your arguments. What are you going to say in the paper? Again, very many early career researchers say we find great insights and we add wonderful things to the literature, but they don't say what. And in this type of paper, and in a professional paper, and even in a piece of journalism, it's very clear that you're going to say right up the front what it is you're going to argue. And what we are going to argue is that what's really unfair is not so much the treatment of suppliers, it's the fact that there is a low wage economy. And if you think about it, there is this terrible irony that we need cheap food to feed people who are on low wages. But the people on the low wages quite often work for the food industry. And the more I've looked into this, the more this is the case. So what we've got to look at if we want to change food systems is about where really does the change need to happen. And if we want a fair society, that change has to happen around the low wage part of the economy, not just about the relationships between suppliers, because some of those, and retailers, because some of those relationships hinge also on low returns and low wages. So that's what we were saying, and we tried to make it absolutely clear. Because one of the obvious things is, well, why don't you just contribute to the trust and transparency literature? Well, everybody's done that. We were trying to say something else entirely. And I then go on to say that we chose our theoretical basis, which was from the political philosopher John Rawls, about what is fair. And then we went on, and I'm not going to give you these because the talk would go on for far too long. We set out our analytical, the reasons we used this analysis and what we found using this analysis. And that's very important. We made it clear right from the start what we were going to argue and what we were contributing to the theory as well as to the knowledge. And this sort of clarity is good. And in fact, I found it so useful that I've actually written the introduction for my new paper before I've written anything else. And I've worked on that introduction several times and presented it as presentations. So I'm pretty clear that the paper is going to work. So people do different things. I've got one friend who always does a PowerPoint to set out his arguments. I've got somebody who always writes the conclusion first. For me, I try and work on a really clear introduction, because if I've got a clear introduction, all I have to do in the conclusion is talk back to those points I raised in the introduction. But I have to say that's quite new. In the past, I've written the introduction last. So my last point is that you finish your introduction to the paper with a bit of courtesy. You tell people what they're going to read, but you don't just say there's going to be a literature review and a methods and a case study and a concluding discussion or findings and recommendations. You tell them what they're going to read about. Now, in my case, the most important bit was the literature review here to set the scene. So I do keep it very brief at the end, but by setting out how we approach the literature, I then followed this structure all the way through. It's the same structure in the case findings and in the discussion. And there's a technical term for this in writing. It's called parallelism. And I'm glad I managed to pronounce that correctly. You're making sure that you don't do things in different orders, that if you've given this order in the literature review, you give this order in the findings, and you give this order in the discussion. Unless there's something that's so crucial in the discussion, it overrides everything else, in which case you might want to put it up front. So that essentially is what I recommend. That when you write, the thing I've learned most in the last 15 years is how to write an introduction. And that entire introduction tells you why my research in that area was so important and why it got into a top journal. And what I'm hoping is going to happen with our next piece. So with our next piece, very quickly, we've looked at a different topic, although it is related, it's still retail. We've looked at the problem of online returns, returns from online shopping, which is actually causing a huge amount of cost in the industry. And what I've said is that the real world problem is that companies have been caught unaware about how expensive it is to run an online business, and that one of the biggest expenses is managing the costs, particularly when you've given free returns and free delivery. So that's our real world problem, and I've put it in the context of the accounting literature, which says there are things going on at the margins that eventually become mainstream. But also, in the margins, there are things that attack the margins of the industry that in crises you tackle that you don't tackle at other times. So online returns is something that happens at the margins of a business, but it also is coming to the forefront. It was already a crisis before the current illness, but with COVID-19, we're expecting in the next few weeks as shops open to find out that companies are hit with a really high cost of returns. So I then go on to say that how we looked at this, which was to do 4 case studies and a number of other interviews, observations, and the development of a cost model. I'm very clear with every statement, and I support everything, every assertion that I make, and every fact that I put in there. The key literature, again, is quite small, so I just have to be able to say that. And then I look out my theory, which is around a theory of communication that I put forward in one of my own papers. And then I say how we're going to use that and how the paper is structured. although I have to say at the moment I might be changing that structure because it's turning out to be a very complicated paper to finish. So essentially, we're looking at a problem that has a real world issue. And not only that, but it's a problem across the world. And it's particularly a problem in the United States because the geography is even greater than it is in Europe, the Middle East, or in Britain. So again, what I'm finding is that this structure I've learnt, okay, it may seem like a formula, but it actually gives a great deal of courtesy to your reader. And it also tells us that you're communicating with an audience that's bigger than academia in the end. You're not just talking to your supervisor, you're not just talking to your examiner. It's not an assignment. And one of the biggest problems with people entering things is they think about it as an assignment. It's not. You're a professional writer talking to an audience. And once I learned that, and I learned more about being a professional writer, and bear in mind, this has taken me 15 years. I think not only that, but although writing is terribly painful, you do start to enjoy it. Which brings us on to the painful part, rejection. Yes, I've been rejected a lot of times, and I've been involved with papers that have had rejections. And I have to give rejections. The hardest thing I found is being the editor of a special issue, because you're working in quite a narrow field. So some of those people who are submitting papers are your friends. And then you have to tell some of your friends that you're not going to publish their work. So you have to be able to give and receive criticism and rejection. And when you're giving it, it's about very similar to what I've said about the introductions. Be precise and padding, give reasons, support what you're saying, and try and be constructive. So what literature? What was your method? What was your most important finding? Because quite often people are not bringing out their most important bit of their work. They've missed the surprising and great element in their hope of ticking all the boxes. So I'd always try and give quite constructive feedback using that model. And when I'm receiving feedback, well, now that is tricky. There are times to be angry. So my piece of advice is this: you're going to get reviews fairly quickly that make you really cross because the person really hasn't understood what you were trying to do. And they've been really critical about that really hard piece of work that you went into, and they don't appreciate the work you've done. Never, ever send an email straight back. Put the piece of work in a drawer, put the letter in a drawer, go away and come back a week later. This is the best piece of advice I can give you. I have had a review back from somebody who said, essentially, the person reviewing this doesn't understand my work. They should have got a proper critical qualitative researcher to look at this who knew something about the food industry. And essentially I had to write back, I am the only person who knows about the food industry and is a critical researcher. You need to be very careful about what you say. Because even if they'd sent it to another journal, there's a pretty good chance it would have come back to me again. So I'm pleased to say we did actually get that paper published. They did actually stick with it. But insulting me wasn't a good way to go about it. And also I've occasionally sent things back saying, look, I'm just not happy with this. But in the end, it's all criticism is good. And in fact, most of the time you just have to be humble and you need to have, as they say in English, a very thick skin. So of the many, many quotes I could have chosen, this one is quite good. You're always learning. You're learning how to be a writer and you're learning how to do research all the time, even when you're into your 70s and 80s. And this is what older professors than me tell me. You're always learning. So you need to know when to be humble and there's always something to learn from any review. I would say that the only reviews you have a right to be angry about are the ones that are really, really short and somebody hasn't paid any attention to what they're doing. They're not going to be very helpful anyway, but somebody could at least have done you the courtesy of giving you some constructive advice. Otherwise, if they've given you a page and it seems very hard, then step back, take a deep breath, and think, did I follow all those points that are laid out in the framework for the introduction? How could I do this better? And if they don't understand it, it must be the way I've communicated it. Because even if other people might understand it, I've still got a bigger audience there. So what we really want to know is that, yes, there's a lot of rejection when you write. It's true of novelists, it's true of poets, it's true of writers in academic circles. It's particularly true in accounting because we're very particular about how we write things. I think we're probably a bit more strict than other disciplines, but that's a story for another day. So I wanted to share with you something from my past that is a really good memory. This is Cambridge University Library, and any academic in the UK is entitled to have a reading pass for the library. You can't take books out, but you can work there. And I have to tell you, most of my thesis was written in the library because I lived nearby. I wasn't a member of the university, but I was able to use the library. And then one day, a couple of years after I'd published my first paper and my thesis, it was all done and dusted, and I was writing another, I was reading this article by Neil Rawlings. And it was just a review of the British business history literature. And we're at this stage, I'd published very little at this stage. And I found this quote in the middle of the paper. It says, similarly, Jack illustrates the change in her article on institutional persistence, etc. And this is the honest truth. I sat there and I thought, that's interesting. There's somebody else called Jack writing about accounting agricultural history. And of course it wasn't, it was me. It was my very first citation. And I tell you what, I've had 970 citations since, but this is the best one. So actually, if you pay attention to the work, the best thing about writing is that sometimes, yes, other people do read it and get to use it, and even sometimes enjoy it. And that really does make it worthwhile. So I hope you found that interesting, and I'm quite open to answering any questions either about my research or about being a writer or about some of the issues you have in the work that you do. So I'm going to stop sharing now. I should just say very quickly that if Ahmed is prepared to send the slides around, there are some references to some very good books. What you'll like is they're all very short as well, and most of them are ebooks. And to my paper that I've been quoting. And thank you very much. There's just a little about the achievements of Portsmouth University. So I'll stop sharing and hand you back to Dr. Ahmed.
Thank you so much, Professor Lisa, for a useful and very good presentation that I myself find it so useful, and there is a lot of information that will help me to improve my paper as well. Now we'll open the floor for question. So anyone want to ask any question, please just raise hand and I will let him to ask a question. So the first one is Zertaj Fatima. Zertaj, your mic is mute, Zertaj. Also, I want to thank all the audience today. The audience from 25 countries. So thank you all. Thank you so much. Yeah.
That's very impressive. So yes,
Uh,
Fatima, I think you
Hiba.
need to unmute. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
The second one is Hiba. Hiba Shalhoub. Yes, Hiba. Hiba. Hiba.
Perhaps type, if you're having trouble being heard, perhaps type the question into the Q&A or into the chat, or... Okay.
Sumaya, you are the second one, the third one, sorry. Sumaya. Sumaya Anam. Your mic is mute. Next one, Ahmed Al Hanayan.
قصر. Yes, hello, I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes,
I
yes,
can,
we can.
yes. Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, this is Ahmed Al Hanayan. I'm from the Dean of College of Business.
Hello. Yes.
I have a question.
Yeah.
You said that writing is a painful task. And actually I'm facing this when I'm writing the discussion that
Yes.
discusses the results and link that to the literature and to the findings. And of course the conclusion as well. Now,
Yes.
especially I am an Arabic speaker. English is not my main language. While my kids, they studied in English schools and they probably write a lot better. So now when can we overcome this? When I can reach the point where I find this type of writing, especially the discussion and the conclusion, is fun, it's art, is interest?
That's a
Thank
very
you.
good question. There's two answers to this. There's a group of people who are professional writers who say it never gets to the point where it's fun. That it will always be painful, which is very dispiriting for all of us. Because it's very much, but you can develop skills that make it easier. And I think this is where in academic writing it's useful to have, if you like, a pattern or a standard. So usually the discussion usually takes me a few goes before I get it right. But what I try to do is say, okay, let's look at the literature. What, if you like, was the gap? What were the key findings from the literature? And I always start with this. I always start off with, what did I find that was surprising? And you always, even if it's something quite small, I think there's nearly always something in our research that came as a surprise to us. We weren't expecting it from the literature. So if you want to make the writing a bit more pleasurable, it's looking for, well, okay, let's find something there that's that's new. Okay, I've got the thing now that I'm saying that nobody else is saying. And that's what I want to get across. So it's good to have a pattern that says, well, we were expecting this from the literature, but it was a surprise. You know, we found something we expected and we found something we didn't expect. Now, I know with quantitative research, sometimes this gets a bit complicated because we were expecting a surprise and the surprise was we didn't get the surprise, if that's not too complicated. But there's always something. So I think the way to make it more enjoyable for the discussion is to remember that it is a discussion and almost to have that discussion in your own head, or even better, have it with somebody else. So rather than trying to make it sort of like a piece of literary writing, which I guess you and I probably came from a stage where that's what we were taught at school. But rather than that, I try and write it down as a discussion. So I think, well, if I'm telling somebody, well, I was expecting this, but I found that. Is that interesting? Well, it is if we think about this. But so with the work we did in that paper I've given you the introduction for, we said, well, actually, we were expecting there to find out that there were quite detailed accounting methods, but there weren't. What we found is there's one performance measure that's used over and over and over again. Okay, what's the problem with that? So what I try and do is have that type of discussion in my head, and that's what I write down first time. Then I edit it to make it a little bit more like a formal piece of writing. But my first draft is always, I'm having a discussion with myself, and that's far more fun and gets you far more insights. Because one of the quotes I didn't put up, but is very important, is that writing is thinking. So you don't have to have it all worked out before you write it down, that writing is thinking. So that would be my answer, would be to think about it as a discussion and write it down very informally, first of all. That's how I go about it. And that's when it starts progressing, because then what you're doing after that is reviewing and editing, and that's the crafting part of it. You have to find your fun where you can, but the fun part really is realizing there's something in your work that you're saying that other people don't know yet. Yeah. Does that help? It's just my view on the situation.
Yes, thank you. That's a great. Thank you. I really enjoyed your answer, and hopefully we'll follow that. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yes, you're welcome. Good luck.
Thank you.
Yes. I can see there's quite a lot of questions coming through. If we don't get through them all, I will try, if Ahmed could, but we'll have the recording, but if we've maybe got to capture some of them, we can perhaps try and get them back afterwards. Somebody did ask a question about where should you put the contribution, in the introduction or in the literature review. The answer is absolutely in the introduction. People are not going to wait to get to the end of your literature review to find out what your contribution is. The people reviewing and the editor won't. So you need to put your contribution very early in the introduction and place it in the context of the literature and of the real world problem that you're talking about. So I hope that answers that question. Ahmed, I think we've got somebody else.
Yeah, Javier, your mic is mute. Yes.
Hi.
Hi.
Good afternoon. Yeah, very nice presentation. Thank you, Professor Lisa. I am a lecturer in accounting and finance at Teesside University.
Okay.
So I just finished my PhD within like last year.
Mm-hmm.
So at the moment, I am writing papers, like drafting papers with other colleagues and also with my PhD supervisor. I just have like some questions that is not about writing, but it's like how you build the relationship not with the potential author, but like the co-authors that you are currently working. Because like different people have different work schedules, the markings, and also the teaching period. So sometimes it's like it takes so long to even just finish the full draft of a paper. So I wonder, is there any tips that how you communicate or encourage in order to make sure that you have a good relationship for completing one? Thank you.
Gosh, that is a very, very good question. And I've had mixed experiences in the past. And I've been the person that's been held up. And I've been the person that's held up other people because of my own schedule. Finding the right people to work with is something you have to try. And sometimes you admit the relationship works well and sometimes it doesn't. Obviously, if you've just finished your PhD, the obvious is to work with your supervisor who has at least put the work in, has seen the work coming through. And sometimes it's a very personal thing. So a friend of mine who's published far more 4-star papers than I have works with a couple of people, and her recipe is that she chooses people who are good at different things. So one of her co-authors is very good at literature reviews and finishing the paper, but hates writing up the findings. My friend Julia loves writing up the findings and doing the analysis, but she doesn't like doing the literature review. And she's got another team where she does a bit more of the literature review, but she's not really a quantitative researcher, but she does the, if you like, the qualitative part, they do the quantitative part. So in some cases, it's having relationships where you do different things. So you're responsible for different parts of the paper, but it doesn't really get around the problem of people being held up. Some of the problem when you're working with your supervisor is that they may be looking at the paper overall and helping you shape it or craft it so that it's suitable for submission. It's respectable enough to be submitted. And that needs to be done, but of course the supervisor has a lot of other jobs on hand. So I think over time, my advice would be, make sure you know who's doing what job on the team. Find people who complement you and that you actually enjoy talking with and working with. And also you have to be very patient. It is going to take some time. The more co-authors you have, the longer it can take to complete a paper. I think at some point the other decision you have to make is whether you take responsibility for the paper and getting it finished. So somebody in the end has to say, okay, we've got as far as we can get. I'm going to finish this, even if you've not done your part or finished your part. Somebody just has to take that decision. Or you just somebody needs to take the lead and say, we are going to do this by this date, and negotiate those dates. So a lot of it's about team management, not about writing. So I agree. The other thing is to be patient, and this is where it becomes a problem. I know as an early career researcher, you want to get those papers out there. But in fact, it does take time. The paper doesn't need to be perfect before it's submitted, but it does need to be respectable. So it needs to be in the format the journal wants. It needs to be in good English. It needs to be proofread. You need to at least have tackled doing a good introduction. I wish I could give you better advice. I'm trying not to sort of go into too many stories about the problems I've had with co-authors or being a co-author. I think the key thing is, as you progress over your career, is to do trial and error a little bit about who complements your way of working. So it's no good if the two of you are really good at doing data and analysis. You need to work with people who are good at doing the other parts of the paper. So you try and build up a team. And that's what I try when I now work with people, or when I choose to work with early career researchers. Either they've got to have very good data and analysis, to which I help them craft or I help with the theory side, or vice versa. So you need a good team, and it's about building that, working with people who complement you, rather than you all being good at the same thing. I don't know, does that help?
Yes, it does. Thank you so much.
You're welcome, and good luck. I hope to meet you sometime if you're in the UK.
Yeah, we actually have met in Belfast under.
Oh, right. I thought I recognized your photograph. It's a very nice. I wasn't quite sure. Oh, it's nice to meet you again then.
I will say hi to you next time.
That'd be lovely, thank you. When we eventually can meet again, yes.
Exactly, hope for the best.
Yes. Okay, thank you. Should we move on to the next question?
For those, you are the next one. Oh, sorry, I hit. Sorry for those. Abdurrahman, Abdu.
Yeah. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Very clearly.
Yeah, it's me, Abdurrahman Sabay, doing PhD in law, not accounting. But
Right.
I really like to thank you for your lecture and about your experience. And I have a question. It's about the comparative studies. You know, in law we do something like about the comparative study.
Okay.
But I need to understand which one is good to go with to make study like in paper associated with uh like professor, someone who is expert in their law in their country, or you do that comparative study by yourself and by your analysis.
That's a very good question. I think it depends on how much data you have at hand. My experience with comparative studies is at some point even if you're not writing with somebody, you at least need to consult them about whether your interpretation is correct. So you need to make some contacts in that country to at least, or with an expert in the law of that country who may be working in your country, for example, because you want to double check that the way you've interpreted the law and understood it is correct. But if you've got the access to the legal documents or to any other form of secondary data, you can do the analysis yourself. But I would say the most efficient and quickest way is to do the analysis yourself and then verify it with people from those countries, or have a bit of a sandwich approach. You talk to them about it first, then you do your analysis, then you build it. If you're going to write the paper with or do the comparative analysis with another person, you need to have a good working relationship where you're sharing ideas the whole time, that there's a lot of communication going on, and that you're maybe even sitting there in a meeting sort of saying, well, this is what it says in this document, what does it say in that document, what's the equivalent? I guess you're going to build up something that's quite structured. So I don't think either of them are better than the other, but it does depend a lot on whether you can find that expert and what role, whether they want to work closely with you or whether they're prepared simply to be a sounding board, somebody you can share ideas with and check with, and who then gets an acknowledgement. In your current situation, what would finding a co-author or somebody to advise you be a problem?
Well, actually, I can't do that by myself, but I thought like if you come as somebody who's expert in their laws, maybe his view of analysis, or when you like
Yeah.
look to that issue, he's gonna look at it from different angle.
Yeah. I think
Right.
if you're going to approach somebody, have a clear idea about what you want to look at. Have a clear idea about what the issue is from the law on your own side, and then approach them and say, I'm very interested to know what it is from the other side and whether there's a comparative study. I think this is part of the building a research network. It's really why we go to conferences and things, so that we find people we can call on. So we've made contact with people we can call on, or we're friends with people who know who you could ask. So I think my advice would be, get a clear idea in your own mind of what you want, what you think the issues are, and what you want to do from your side, and then approach somebody. It doesn't matter if it's just an outline of an idea, but make sure you're clear in your own mind first, would be my advice. Rather than just
Thank you a
saying, I
lot.
want to do a comparative study.
Uh,
Yeah.
Can I ask? Could I ask one more question? It's about like
I'll
lead
try.
author. You know.
Yeah.
Let's
Yeah.
be
Is
quick,
it?
Abdurrahman.
If it's
Yeah,
quick,
it's so
do a
quick.
little
It's,
cue.
it's about like lead author. You know, I'm
Mm.
PhD research scholar, and if I associate with professor or associate professor, I don't know. If I put myself as lead author, is it like kind of problem something? I don't understand, because I talked
Yeah.
with that professor who I am associating with,
Well,
and he
I
asked
can
me to
tell.
be the lead author.
Okay. Well, the convention is, or the conventions I use are these. If we've all done an equal amount of work, then the names go in alphabetical order of surname. If the work is done by a PhD student or an early career researcher, I always, regardless if my name comes first or second alphabetically, I always ask to go last. Because in my view, it's always the person who's done the work and whose project it is that should go first on the paper. You'll get it doesn't matter, it's all blind reviewed. And I can tell you now, just having a professor on the paper doesn't mean it's going to get any more attention than if it doesn't. And if it does get more attention, it's for reasons that are not fair to other people. So it's quite an often asked question, and maybe other people are asking it, is, does it help to have a professor on the paper? Well, unless that professor's actually put some work in, I'm very reluctant, though I do know it happens. But the courtesy is that it's the person whose project it is goes first, and it won't get you any more attention from the editors just having a professor there. If they have contributed to your project and they've contributed to the paper, you should go first. That would be my view.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I really appreciate it.
You're welcome, and good luck with your career in publishing. Okay. Is there another question, Ahmed?
Yes.
Hello.
Firdaus?
Hello. Can you
Hello.
hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. Thank you for your lecture. One of the questions I would like to ask is that in certain areas of research, you try to follow the previous paper, that they have worked on a different material and you are working on a different material. The set of the techniques and the set of the parameters are more or less the same. So when you start writing, one of the concern you have is that there will be plagiarism, because everybody is more talking nowadays about plagiarism, and that's just, as you quoted in the beginning, that we shouldn't be more going towards the flowery language as has been the technique done in the past to attract the attention. We should be rather be more straightforward, which leaves less space for the choice of words and being more direct. It would be more or less from one or to other paper the same thing. So how do
Yes,
you
it's a
really
problem.
tackle that situation?
I think it's about having, in the end, is the good paper, and the charge against plagiarism is having really good content and being very clear. It is, I can see what you mean about having the sort of feel of your own language in there gives it its identity. But in the end, a research paper is judged by its content. And it's about you making it clear that your work is different to other people's. So it's about being very clear that it's not plagiarism. You've found something that's different or that's worthwhile. And even if you're supporting another thesis, it's about saying very plainly, yes, this person said this, this person said this. These are the key important papers in my area. I found something that's worthwhile and is different. And that you say this right at the front of the paper, because then it becomes absolutely clear that you're not plagiarizing or copying. And it also makes it clear that if somebody else says that and it's before or after you, or they've said it after you've presented it or something, you can very much clearly go and say, look, I said this first. So it's about, if you like, being very precise about what you are contributing to. And that's more likely to give you a protection against plagiarism than the style of language. However, having said that, you've touched on a really important point, which has been picked up by some quite important professors in business schools, which is we're actually constraining people's power of expression and their ability to develop their own voice in writing.
Correct.
Yeah. But we're doing two things here. The way I get round it is I write things that are not for academic journals, and then I can express myself as I like, as long as I do clearly.
That makes it quite easy. If you talk about some newspaper or a magazine, because it's more oriented towards the general audience. But when you talk about talk about the scientific paper, it's not. It's meant for your own community or meant for a community who have a specific interest in it, and there it becomes harder to push yourself in or those fit into that situation.
It is. It's very. Yeah. Sorry. Carry on.
I'm with you. It's very hard to fit yourself into such a situation, and you really have a good language. You have a hold on the language, but still you are struggling because at the end they put it into the software, and the software gives you this is the plagiarism here. You need to reduce your plagiarism.
But I think in the end, you could. It's about at the start, as I said. Not if you're using quotes, make it clear that you're quoting. If you're paraphrasing somebody else, really make that synthesized with others' work, so that you're not just following the same style of wording as somebody else. It is harder work. I think all I can say is the Accounting Organisations and Society paper is one of the ones I'm really pleased with, because although it was a lot of it was very hard work. I said we first submitted it in 2015. We'd actually been writing it since 2013. So I did a lot of work on it before I even submitted it. And then there was another 3 years work after that. So the reason I'm proud of it, though, is that I actually feel there is something of my voice in there, because I was getting familiar with what I was talking about. I could argue very clearly. And I realized it was slightly different to a quantitative paper where you've got a narrower area where you can argue your case. But I think you do find a way of writing. I think it's, first of all, you have to say, well, I want to get published, so I'm going to follow these conventions. But what you make sure is that you're very clear about what you're doing that other people are not doing. So even if they say this area is similar to somebody else's, you've made it very clear that it's not. And that's what the editors then look at. So trying not, when you're drawing on other people's work, to follow a similar pattern. But I do appreciate that in quantitative work, there's only so many ways you can say things some of the time.
And so one thing I've noticed regarding the changes that have taken place from the Victorian era to the present scientific community, it has been a huge curve that has been really going on progressively, and keeping on monitoring the changes. Sometimes when you dig into a paper which is from 1960s, that's a brilliant work done in that area, it would be really hard to fit into the present paper. How do you really match the two, blend them together? Because some work has been reported and then it was forgotten or neglected, but then you are interested in going further on it, and there isn't really much done in that area because I think there has been not any business interest or people haven't liked it. So how do you really cater to that?
What you have to do is make
Yes.
a really good case for bringing it back. It's not sufficient that it was published in itself. So I would be very plain. I'd say, I'm taking this paper. It was published in the 1960s, and at that time, it attracted this amount of attention, and we can see that by these other authors who have used it. Or if it's been neglected, say. So you've either got the one of saying it was used, but then it stopped being used because of either this criticism or just was not followed up. However, I'm going back to it for these reasons, because now they made this point in the 1960s, it wasn't taken up, but it's now become relevant again. Therefore, it's worth. So what I do is have that discussion where you're talking through why you think this paper is worth pulling up on. And you have to do a bit of hard work here, because you have to, if you like, distill that 1960s paper into the language of the 2020s.
Yes, that's my point.
Yeah, you have to. So what you have to do is do some real work yourself in getting what is the essence of their paper. What was the most important thing they were saying? How did they go about it? Would we do that now? So it's a bit like I was telling our colleague earlier. It's about having that discussion in your mind and writing it down on paper, and then crafting it around, because you have got a good reason for using that paper. Other people aren't going to see it, so you're almost going to have to stand up in court and give a good case for it. And that's almost how you think about it. Yeah, it's almost as if you're standing up in court as a witness and saying, these are the reasons, and then support every one of your reasons, which means you're going to have to do some work, you know, digging out the people who've used the paper, the alternatives that people went with rather than this. It's almost like doing a systematic review. It's a chronology. There's a type of literature review you can do on a seminal paper. There used to be quite a good part on it, but the book isn't published anymore. If you drop me an email, I'll
if you share your email, I would be happy to drop your mail.
Yeah, I've put the email at the end of my presentation, so hopefully Dr. Ahmad can share it as well. It's fairly public.
Thank you for your time.
I can tell you the old book where there's a good passage on this, and then maybe we can share it with others.
Okay, nice.
Brilliant.
Lovely.
Gosh, we got a lot of messages. Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
Thank you for those. Please, Hanouf, go ahead.
Hello.
Yes, hello. Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes. We certainly can.
Yes.
Hello.
Yes, I thank Dr. Ahmed, and thank you, Professor Lisa. Actually, I have two questions. The first one is for the publication, if my sample size and power calculation is really large, but I had some of like small errors in my experiment, do you think that will make my paper low quality because of a small error, but I have a large sample? Would that matters for publication, the sample size?
Certainly the fact you managed to get a large sample size would be a good factor for a paper, because obviously the larger the sample size, the more you would hope that any errors become not so much of an issue. Now, I'm not an expert on quantitative research, despite my maths degree.
Okay. My second.
But you know, small errors, it depends on how you explain them, because you could turn it in and say, well, there's a limitation here, but this is what's still valid. So it comes back, I think what's coming through to this is it's about not trying to hide it, but just being absolutely upfront. And then if the reviewers come back, they've got something to work with. Rather than saying we think there's something odd here, they can come back and say, well, this is your explanation, but we're not convinced. Can you do this instead? So it's about being very plain about what you've done and not hiding what you've done. But saying, and also digging into, you know, can you find some support for the fact that your large sample size can offset any minor errors that have taken place? And also then have a discussion in your paper about whether that minor error is relevant or not.
Great. It's about a systematic review. Actually, I have already published a systematic review. And after that, thank you, I'm a PhD student. And actually, after 2 months, I discovered somebody also published a systematic review, which was really similar of my topic. The problem was surprise with me and actually with my supervisor, but we have registered to do the systematic review with York University. You know, sometimes we need to register, but it's just like we were totally surprised that somebody is almost copy paste or the ID of the systematic review. So would you think that ethically that would be, but I mean the journal have already published her work or her systematic review. The title does not match the constants of the systematic review, but it seemed to be kind of copy paste of what have been done, with a slightly small difference. Do you think
this is the same journal as yours or a different journal? So your paper, but your one was published first?
Yes, in BMC, yeah.
Okay. Well, you're in the strong position then.
You
have to break this down into two sides. The one problem with a systematic review of the same literature is that, by definition, if you're following a very similar systematic process, you should end up with the same results.
Okay.
Because obviously it's a systematic review. That's if you're using very similar phrases and similar words on the same literature, then like a scientific experiment, it should come up the same. But your worry is that they haven't actually done the work themselves. They've actually just copied what you've done. Now, there's only a couple of months between it. Did you present the work at any time before it was published?
Yes. I mean, I was looking for grey literature. So I was emailing a lot of PhD researchers, also professors, to just dig in some of like grey literature or information.
Okay.
So I have already, like, let's say I have added my title and what I'm looking for. So that was before, but then when my paper had been accepted, then after that, when it was published, we just discover, like, after 2 months, another paper was published with the same idea, actually, and also of the same research. It's well, the strategy of database, it's kind of different, but it is the same charisma. Exactly, copy paste the charisma diagram.
Okay, then you have got an issue. I mean, these are very different cases, difficult cases ethically. You need the support of your supervisor, I think, if you're going to do anything about it, and of the university. But there are essentially only two two approaches. You either write to the author very respectfully, or you write respectfully to the editor of the journal in which she's published a paper and say, I have some concerns. And it may be they come back and say, well, we were aware of your paper, but we think this is sufficiently different. So these cases are quite difficult. I think you either need to say, well, at least we were first, and therefore people need to quote us. If you think there's a clear case of plagiarism, then I think you need to, or unethical behavior, I would talk to your supervisor and the university before you take any action.
Okay. Thank you thank you very much. And also last question, please. For the introduction, you advise that we should just go straight to the point, if I get it right.
Yes.
But it's like, if there is a problem which is worldwide, and then I have to get to the point of this problem is highest, high prevalence, let's say, of, for example, for obesity. I need to choose one of the country which is have the highest. So is it not a good idea starting from worldwide and then, like, let's say GCC countries and then the country itself, or just get to the point, like, this country is suffering?
Get to the point. Say this country is suffering from this, and by the way, it's a problem in a lot of other countries as well, as evidenced by this. So start with the specific problem, then give it the world context. So
I had another way of advice. My supervisor said to start worldwide, then start the country.
Well,
so I don't know which one is the right way.
I'm not sure there is a right way at the end. I've just told you the way I would do it.
Great.
But even if you're going to go worldwide, try and make what you're saying about the problem rather than the world, if you see what I mean. Don't say this is a huge problem all over the world. Say this is the problem and you can find it in these countries worldwide. So make it more about the problem than the fact it's worldwide. But you can then start with the world, all over the world, but try and avoid those big phrases.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Hanu.
Okay, there's a couple of questions in the chat that I think people would like to pick up because they don't particularly want to ask them themselves. Do you mind if I just answer them very quickly?
Yes, sure.
Yeah. One is from Uzma, has said, I think I can't find your other question at the moment, but you've asked about people saying the research hypothesis should be in chapter 1, but it must be part of the literature. They need to be in chapter 1 because some people won't read beyond chapter 1. So you always put your hypothesis, you put what the hypotheses are and make a statement in chapter 1, and then you build them and show how you got them in the literature review. But they always need to be in the PhD. Your research question and your hypothesis, you say we're going to look at these hypotheses, and then you say the development of these hypotheses is shown in the literature review. That's how I would go about it. Or you give a summary of the hypotheses in the chapter 1, and what's even more important is you give the underlying research question. Because, the chapter 1 is like the introduction. You've got to give the whole overview of the thesis in there, and it's important to have that. I had very few corrections on my thesis, but I had forgotten to put in the research question into chapter 1 very clearly. So that would be my advice. I mean, take others' advice as well, but that would be my advice. You do it twice. It's not one or the other. You do it in both. And then Lobna has given a very good point, which is about self-doubt and criticism. This is something we all have to suffer from. And there's also something called imposter syndrome, where we all think we're not up to doing the work. yes, there is self-doubt, but the only answer is to keep working at it. There's lots of professional writers can give you stories. Yes, okay, some people never get published, but other people just keep on trying. So for example, let's take a very, very famous example. J.K. Rowling sent Harry Potter to a huge number of publishers until it got to Bloomsbury. And then it got published and was made a worldwide phenomenon. If you're into that, well, it's possibly because I had children who were into it. And yes, we all get doubts about our writing. Some people do. I mean, I have one co-author I work with who says very clearly, I'm not a very good writer. But she works with other people who can help shape her work. And we've worked together and had quite a successful paper. And she also employs, okay, she's in a position to do this, but she always gets somebody to professionally edit her work. Now, you've got to get to a point where they're not rewriting what you've done. But I think you've got to understand that you will suffer from self-doubt at times, but you just keep trying. And you are going to get criticism. I had one review back where the reviewer said, I give up. I'm not even going to try this anymore. They don't know what I'm talking about. And believe me, to get a letter where somebody says, oh, this is hopeless, I'm going to give up, that's not very nice. The paper eventually got published. I've had a couple of very rude reviews as well. But unfortunately, being a writer means you're going to get quite a lot of criticism, quite a lot of rejection. I don't know, sort of just keep working, presenting. And if you're it might be that you're just trying too high. And I'm slightly against this idea that everybody has to have a really high level paper as their first paper. It used to be that you could start off a bit smaller scale and learn how to write. And those people that appear lots of times in top journals tend to be those older people who had the chance to learn their writing skills. So maybe, make a small win and then build on it. There's all sorts of advice. I've recommended 2 or 3 books, and they give some really good advice about this problem. So maybe pick up one of the books that I've suggested at the end of the presentation. And don't give up. But yes, if it's any consolation, I get a bit down as well, and I have my own doubts about whether I can do things. In particular, I've committed to writing quite a difficult book, and I'd have days, I can tell you, where I'm not sure I can do it, but I'll still keep trying. Okay, sorry, Ahmad. Sorry, I wanted to get those 2 because they were quite important questions.
Sure. Wafa?
Yes. Hi.
Hello.
Hi, everybody. Hi, Professor Lisa. Hi, Dr. Ahmed. Thank you, Professor, for this informative webinar, actually. Actually, I have only one question. My major is applied linguistics, and many of my colleagues keep asking me to help them to develop their own academic writing style, especially in engineering major and medicine one. My question is, what's a better way that I can use in order to help them keep going and develop their academic writing?
It sounds to me they don't quite understand what linguistics is about necessarily.
No, my field of study is applied linguistics.
Is applied linguistics. Okay, so
yeah,
there is, yeah.
Yeah, so they are keeping asking me to help them in writing or develop their academic writing. But since their measures are scientific one, I don't know what should I focus on. Should I focus on the structure of writing or the selection of academic words, or what are the area that I should focus on in order to help them?
Okay, I do apologize. I now see what your problem is. Particularly in those areas, there's actually even more than in business schools. There's a very set way of writing. And I actually work with an engineer who has a very different way of writing to I do. It's much, in some ways, it's much more straightforward. And they don't spend a lot of time developing arguments or arguing points. There's a lot more factual writing in those disciplines. So in some ways, they do need to learn the language of their discipline. In the end, I think there's a limit to what somebody else can do. They themselves have to do a lot of reading. So the other tip, writing is thinking, but also professional writers read a lot. So there's no real shortcut. I think what you could do is help them go through some good articles in their area. So actually, rather than sort of looking, I would actually sort of deconstruct an article with them. So read it along with them, if you like, because you'll learn a little bit then as well. I mean, the other thing to say is, well, I'm not the right person to talk to. You need to talk to another engineer or another scientist who are good at writing. And there are books that are particularly geared towards writing in those disciplines.
What about writing in general, writing in English for academic purposes? Are there specific books or guidelines that we should follow in order to develop this area?
Yeah, there's some very good books.
Yes.
I've given some shorter ones on the end of the presentation, and somebody asked if we could put it up again, but
Yes.
we'll maybe do that
I
right
wish
at the end. But we will actually, I'm quite happy for Ahmed to make the slides available to people.
okay.
But there are some key books on writing English which fall into two categories. One are just writing good English and writing clear, and there's others which are about writing academic English. There is a whole series of things on called English for Academic Purposes, EAP. Yeah. But I think probably the best thing is I'm quite happy if, say, Ahmed or you drop me an email, and I will give you. Yeah. I'm pretty sure I've already got a list, or somebody else has a list of these books. So if I can give you that link, I will. But you know, I'm not very good at remembering the titles off the top of my head.
I will send you an email.
But the answer is yes, there are a lot of books on writing clear English. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you, Wafa. Dr. Asad.
Okay.
Hello, Professor Lisa.
Can Hello. You hear me? I can, yes.
Okay. Nice to see you again. I think we met in Buffer 2018. Then I was a PhD student, but now I'm a doctor, so.
Oh, congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. The question relates to the literature review. So nowadays, if we explore the 4-star and 3-star journals, especially in finance and accounting, we see that most of them do not have the literature review section. So they, after introduction, and they directly go to hypothesis development and then methodology and so on and so forth. So the question is how you or maybe your colleagues or other reviewers see this, that the complete section of literature review is not there in the paper. And does it have any impact on the acceptance, or your views, please?
Okay. Obviously, a lot of my work is in qualitative research, and quite often they expect the literature review to be there. In some of the more quantitative or experimental papers, I think it is there, but it's not called a literature review section. So you've got, in the introduction, you've got a clear statement of which papers you're adding to, or what the area of research is. So then you're referencing the papers. And in the methodology and methods, you're quite often saying that these papers have taken this approach. So effectively, you have got a literature review, but it's not called that.
Mm-hmm.
So what you will find is in the methodology section, there will be an analysis of the methods and methodologies used by other people. And in the introduction, there will be some analysis of the papers that you're contributing to. My own view is that what's the worst that can happen? If you submit a paper and it's got, I would say in that case, if you've got a short review of the literature because you're trying to position where the paper belongs, the worst that can happen is they're going to ask you to take it out or to say it's not necessarily because of the word count. If you don't put it there and it's not clear from your introduction or the methodology which literature you're using, then it's more likely to be rejected. So you have to do the literature review. It's really a case of how you present it. Does that make sense? My view would be I would have, like I've shown in the presentation, I would have in the introduction a very clear statement of which papers I'm building on.
Okay. So the classical way to this was that, okay, if we are finding, I'm talking about more empirical finance.
Yes.
The classical view is that if we are finding the relationship between A, B, and C, let's say, or A and B, then what we do is we describe the literature on A and then B, then they connect them.
Yeah.
Okay. What I see nowadays that there is no description of A and B. They directly connect it. So, and what is the link between them? And they talk about this thing only. So is it necessary to give the background information, or we can go directly? That's the main question.
This is, I think even if they're going directly, what they're missing is the explanation of those papers. But what I think you probably will find is that there has been some commentary on what the most important points are, what the links are. So they've not given a précis of the paper or a comparative review of the papers, but they have pulled out what the most important points of those papers were that linked up. Now, I don't read as many of these papers as I should, but I suspect that I think it would be worth going back and saying, well, there seems to be very little here. Is it really the case that they're just saying paper X and paper Y? Or is there some critical comment about the important thing that's been pulled out and linked together? Which means you have to do the literature review. It just depends on how much of it you're going to use when you're writing, and whether the journals you're looking at are assuming everybody knows what those papers are saying. But I suspect there's something, even if it's not a lengthy analysis.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's nothing to hurt being absolutely clear about what you're doing. What I would avoid in those cases is doing a lengthy literature review. I would hit for the type of literature review that says these are the most critical points in these papers, and this is what we're trying to address in our paper. Okay.
Yes, I got your point. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Asad. Godfred.
So, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Godfred Frifa from the University of Kent in the UK, accounting department. I have two quick questions for Professor Lisa. Professor God, thank you very much. My first question relates to papers that have been rejected from one journal. If I want to send that paper to another journal, do I have to necessarily take all the reviewers' comment into account? Because sometimes they say things that are somehow relevant, but you don't know what the other reviewer from the second journal might also come up with. And sometimes to some of the comments that they give, it tends to begin to change the focus of your paper. And because you are sending to a different journal, do I have to really consider their comments?
Right. The answer is yes, but not fully. There's one practical reason, is because you've got no guarantee that you won't get the same reviewers again. So you might send it to another journal, but you might get the same reviewers. So you don't want to annoy them by not having done anything with their comments. On the other hand, you may feel you can't address the comments. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you an example because I had this situation last week.
Okay.
So I'm working with 2 other people and our paper was rejected on a second review. So we'd already reviewed it, revised it, but they rejected it on the second round. Now, what we did, we pulled out those points which we thought were most relevant. So they said something, if they say if there are comments about the structure of the paper or that they hadn't understood something about the way you'd explain the contribution, then it's likely that that's not going to be clear either to the next people who read it. So if there's some structural things or some practical things that need to be addressed in the paper, I would definitely attend to those.
Okay.
And certainly if they pointed out some minor errors that you can easily change. When it comes down to the more fundamental, this is where we had the discussion. So they said we thought we'd change the literature review and the contributions to make it clear what the contribution to the literature were, but they still weren't getting it. So we're going to have another go at that.
Okay.
When it came to the theory, we disagreed with what one of the reviewers said. But the second reviewer, because basically the first reviewer basically said, well, I think you should throw the theory away and try something else. But we weren't convinced by his argument for throwing it away. We think he's got a different understanding of the theory to us, and we found other papers which follow what we do. So we're going to keep the theory on those grounds, but the second reviewer made some very good points about the way the theory was used and presented. So we're taking those on board. So my answer would be that yes, before you resubmit it, I would take what's sensible and doable from the reviews that you've got and rewrite the paper to address those points because they're probably going to come up again.
Okay.
But because you're not resubmitting the paper to the same journal, you're not under the same obligation to address or rebut every point in the review.
Okay.
So if you do get the same reviewer, you can say, well, and they'll at least be able to see that you did something to the paper on the basis of the reviews you've got.
Okay.
Yeah, the worst mistake anybody can make is just saying, well, these reviewers didn't understand it, I'll just send it to somebody else.
Okay.
Because the reviewers always have something you can put in.
Okay.
But you're not obliged to take everything, particularly unless both reviewers are saying, absolutely, this theory is wrong, or you've misunderstood something, which doesn't happen very often. I would take on board those things you can take on board and do. Because as you say, the next set of reviewers may have a different view again and you only end up rewriting it again.
Okay.
So does that help?
Yes, please. Thank you very much. And my second question relates to the ref submission.
Oh, yes. Okay.
As you said at the beginning of your presentation, it's quite tough to get a 3-star. So my question is, after securing your 3 or 4 stars for the ref, do you hoard your papers for the next ref, or you just keep publishing, thinking that you will oversupply, and then when it comes to the next ref, you might struggle to get enough papers to support your ref submission?
Oh, that's a difficult one. I'm afraid I have to preface this by saying I have to be very careful what I say because I'm on the ref sub-panel for business and management. So I've got to be very careful about the advice I give you on this. I think it's about practicalities. And what you have to make a balance about how many papers you are going to be submitted, because obviously this time it's an average of 2.5 papers
Yes.
per person rather than the 4 for every person, but you can have up to 5. The honest answer is I've got one paper with the co-author that we are not going to submit till later in the year, partly because we don't want to rush it through the review process, but partly also we do have sufficient papers each. On the other hand, there are other reasons you need papers other than the ref, you know, in terms of promotion and other areas. I think at this particular stage, I would say if it hasn't been published yet, the chances of it getting all the way through the review process and being in print. I realized that the date, they haven't brought out the new date for the extension on the outputs. So it's likely to be later than the November, December date it was. I mean, the trouble is they're going to expect you to have, in the next ref period, you're going to get caught in the fact they want to see papers published all the way through that period. So stocking up may give you some freedom. You know, it's almost impossible to answer that question about what's best. I just wouldn't rush them through unduly.
Okay.
I think the key thing is to have a good paper in the long run. If you've got, the only difference would be is if you've got some problems internally where they would like you to have another paper. And whether there's any other good reasons for having that 3-4-star paper now. But you can't say that 3-4-star journals in accounting work quickly. So you may actually have the decision made for you by the fact it's still going through the process. Does that help, Godfred? I'm sorry, it's a bit better. And I think we have met. I at least remember your name from another event, so it's nice to talk to you again.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Last question, Nizar.
Yes. Okay. Hello, Nizar.
Hi, Professor. Thank you for the presentation. It was very enriching.
Thank you.
I finished my PhD in last year, and my area of research is career and organizational commitment. And my sample was taken from Kuwait. Okay. Now, my question is, I'm planning to publish research papers based on my PhD research. Now, the question is, do I publish based on literature gaps or business problems? Now, and my second question is how to align literature gaps to business problems in order to have a valid and respectable research paper?
That's an excellent question, and not an easy one to answer. Certainly, if you want to publish in a higher level journal, it's good to show that there is a business reason, that there is a sort of real world, if you like, a real world application of the problem. And I do realize in some areas where you're doing quite theoretical or you're doing quite detailed archival work, that it's not always easy to bring these two together and it can sound a bit contrived. But usually there is a business reason or a practical application why somebody might be interested in your work. So I would go through a few steps. I would say, well, the data is from Kuwait, but does Kuwait have unique problems or does it have problems that are faced by other countries? So first of all, I would put it in that context. I would also make it very clear when my writing, is this a problem from a gap in the literature? And I would go back in the literature and say, well, why did they start looking at this? Is it simply that they saw that there was some statistical anomaly? Or is it because there is a general problem? Now, the most famous paper for this is when they started looking at the statistical anomaly on stock stock bonuses and remunerations, and found that there was a manipulation. I think it's about digging around. I think the more you can put your local in the sense of your national data into a larger context and make a case that it's interesting on an international basis and not just locally, that that the local data is showing something that's repeated elsewhere or could be a problem elsewhere because of the way businesses are run, then the more chance you have it being published in a better journal. But I think it's a case of carefully piecing it together. You need to do some detective work. I mean, can you give me an idea about what problem you think?
Okay.
What's the gap in the literature?
Well, first of all, the critical difference is societal culture. People interrupt and react to career and organizational commitment differently. Because in this part of the world, we perceive career and organization commitment in a different way when we compare to the West.
Okay, that's
now,
interesting.
I find it somehow challenging to relate it to a business challenge or a real world challenge, because we're talking about here if a Western person, for example, would come to work in Kuwait, would see that we do things in relation to such two concepts in a different way. Now, the challenge is when I heard that in your presentation that we need to link it to business or practical issue, I was thinking, well, how can I align this to business, to international context?
Okay, well, I would say one of the ways would be to say, well, first of all, can you identify the positives and negatives of the approach taken in Kuwait? And then put it in the context of saying that actually this is different. I can show that it's different to other parts of the world because of this literature. But actually there's something that could be learnt from it. And I think that's probably, in this context, is probably the best way to go. It's sort of starting a dialogue about what works well, and does it work well just because everybody understands the culture, or because it's something that could be usefully done elsewhere as well, and what would it take? So I think it's about extending the discussion that you're having. It's almost about taking that management idea of asking why 5 times. You know, sort of, why do we do that here? Why isn't it done elsewhere? Well, why not? And almost going through that sort of discussion in your mind. Sort of say, well, where does it take? What are the consequences? What would be the consequences if we stopped doing this? What would be the consequences if other people, we didn't stop doing it, but other people took it up and learned from it? And try and look at it in that way. I mean, you're on slightly dangerous ground, because you'll need to see whether anybody else has looked at this in a similar way. But it's about that sort of trying to just build up the context bit by bit, and almost asking yourself, well, why would somebody be interested? Could they learn from the negatives? Could they learn from the positives? Could we do something differently? Could other people do something differently? It's starting having that conversation, I think. I'm sure you already are to a great extent, but it's about trying to phrase that into the introduction of the paper.
Okay, one last quick question, very quick.
Okay.
How to focus the research question for the research paper? I mean, sometimes you think that you have the best research question in the world, and when you go to write about it, you end up finding, well, nothing's there. Maybe you have a literature for it, but you don't know how to align it, to focus it, to be more specific, clear, convincing, and, you know, have a hit. So what do you suggest in this perspective?
They need to be rewritten several times. So all I can tell you is the way I do it. I write it down as in as everyday language as I can, is my first one. So I don't try and write it academically to start with. I try and write it in everyday language. So I suppose the best example I can give is from my own thesis, where I was looking at a particular method of accounting in agriculture. And the way I wrote the question, first of all, in everyday language was, why are these people using this method of accounting while it's so obviously out of date? And it turned out there's some very interesting reasons why. But when it got into my thesis, it was about how, how the understanding of accounting practice had changed over time and the historical consequences of it. I can't remember my exact wording now. But I always try that now. I always try and write my research questions, first of all, in as everyday language that I can explain to my husband or somebody else, or my mother, or something like that, and see whether they get an idea. Now, obviously, I think you're working in a slightly more esoteric area than I am. I think you're working in a slightly clearer area, but I would start with not even trying to make it sound academic. I would try and say, well, okay, I found this gap. What does it mean? How could I explain it to somebody in everyday language? And then just keep refining it. It's the way of phrasing it. Whether finding out whether you've got a good question is partly it's then looking in the professional journals and others, say, is anybody talking about this issue? Is it something, or have people looked at it and it's gone nowhere? It's asking you some hard questions about. The one that usually comes up is that maybe nobody's asked this question because it's not worth asking. So what you've almost got to do is create your argument about why it's worth asking. I'm afraid there isn't an easy answer to that one, but I always start with going back to everyday language. And then that sometimes triggers off other ideas. Sometimes I start with the business problems first and then go and see if the literature's done anything about it. So I keep an eye on the business news and interesting articles and then go back and look and then fit it together that way. I don't know if that's helpful or not. I feel I'm talking around some ideas there.
Well, actually, it is helpful, because sometimes small things make big change. I thank you for your time and for your insights. Is it possible to share your email if you don't mind?
Yes, it's on the end of the presentation.
I will send that.
I'm quite happy for Ahmed to send it around to people.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
I will reply as quickly as I can, but I do get a lot of emails.
Okay, thank you for your help. Thank you for your help, and thank you, Dr. Ahmed, for your for this event. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lisa, for your time and effort, and sorry for who didn't have the opportunity to ask a question. We have a lot of questions here and also in QA and the chat, so we are so sorry. Please don't forget to fill the survey after leaving the webinar. Also, I want to announce the next webinar. It will be preparing for your PhD oral examination by Professor Khalid Al-Husseini next week. Thank you again for everyone for following ITAR group webinars. Please connect with LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, or ResearchGate, all of them in the same name, which is Dr. Ahmed Al-Kattan. Thank you again, and also I want to thank there is some names I saw them. They came to the meeting room before 1 hour from the webinar began. So thank you all of you, and thank you again once again, Professor Lisa, for your time and effort. And see you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
You are welcome.